Mics are good. Beautiful. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We're going to wait just 1 minute here and let everybody else kind of jump aboard here.
In the meantime, this is our weekly live streaming. We do this every single week, 8:45 Pacific Standard Time, a.m. in the morning. That was...
Wow. Really, really good there.
Yep. You know.
So every Sunday, tune in 9 a.m. PST.
If you're watching in our podcast, this is uploaded in podcast form. Again, we upload this weekly based on our Sunday morning live stream. And the format kind of goes, we do some genus and or overall beer news. Then we go into a beer of the week where we break down a style from the BJCP certification judge thing. Words are good. And then we go into 2 discussion topics, just kind of whatever we feel like talking about that week. And we end with Q&A, meaning you get to ask us your questions, and we high-five you for it.
And try to give you some half-decent answers if everything goes well.
Yeah, when you can.
Speaking of going well, let's go right into some genus news this week. Shall we start about the our very first hard seltzer and the trials that we kind of went through there?
Yeah, so we did do a few hard seltzers. Our idea was to try to figure out what yeast first is going to be best, and so we're doing a similar hard seltzer line, trying it with multiple yeasts. We'll be doing the same experiment a second time with 3 different yeasts that we didn't use this first time, but we used the classic champagne, Yeast 1118. We use Bubbles, which is a champagne-esque cidery yeast from Imperial Yeast, and then we decided to switch it up with some French Saison yeast. And we did learn a couple things.
Yeah, it sounds like the French Saison was actually the best yeast out of them all. With that said, all of them being fairly neutral, and I think that just comes down to the fact that we're throwing sugar in water. So there's really nothing for these yeasts to work with. Not a lot of sugars to have these complex fermentations. So it's really hard to actually get varying flavors from the yeast. Ultimately, we ended up blending them all together in a half barrel keg. We did 3 5-gallon batches, and that keg is actually now on tap. And then I think you did kind of all the flavoring involved with it, right, Peter?
Nope, Tim actually did that. We used essences from Vanilla to flavor this one, a mix of pear and orange peel flavor essences. Pretty simple process. All we did was load them in the kegs and then put the hard seltzer on top. So nothing too special about that, except for the fact that we did use Vanilla's essences, which are all natural, high oil content. We're basically just trying to get that aromatic expression from the flavorings and not so much that sweet flavor that you would off of like a syrup or something.
Yep. And while we did not filter the seltzer, I believe we did fine it, right?
We did a 2-stage fining on the seltzer with Kiesel salt and chitosan, which is the same things we use kind of across the board. And so we might experiment with some filtering down the road, but that's kind of our go-to. It turned out pretty dang clear this time. So.
Yeah, it's got like maybe the slightest bit of haze that I honestly don't think anyone would complain about. Otherwise, the 1-2 punch of Kiesel salt and chitosan pretty much clear up anything. So that's always our go-to method. But otherwise, on tap now. We've sold, a dozen pints last night and had nothing but positive reviews about it. So I think we're off to a good start. With that said, I did notice on the nose it does smell just ever so slightly like, I call it the champagne yeast smell.
Yeah, it's got that little like a wine funk, like if you get Cook's or a cheaper champagne.
Yeah. I think if we can figure out how to just neutralize that little bit of aroma, then we'll be where we want to be there.
I think playing with the yeast is a good place to start, though. So the next round of experiments, instead of going any sort of wine yeasts, I think we're going to go all, because both the Bubbles and the EC 1118 had that smell. It was slight. And the French Saison did not have that smell. Yeah. So I think the strategy is going to be trying a couple different beer yeasts, maybe some Abbey yeasts, or
I'd go like an English strain.
Yeah,
and just give that a good shot.
Even a Brettanomyces. We're gonna try to play around with more yeast until we kind of lock in what we like best, and then after that we're gonna try to figure out how to add more complexity to the yeast, either with varying up our nutrient additions or maybe even trying to add a more complex sugar to the mix.
Yep. So anyway, that's our seltzer trials number 1. We're gonna keep you guys updated on that. That is a really fun kind of new experimental thing that we've been doing. That it's so new to the industry that there's hardly any information out there on
especially
it.
in the beer world, in the natural fermentation. Guys like us wanting to make some funky seltzers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that isn't just hard A and sugar.
Yeah, exactly.
other flavorings. Also, you got your malt video out, which I don't know about the thumbnail on, but
Everyone
has some good info about crystal malts and the banes that lie within them.
Everyone gives me crap and thinks that I actually hate crystal malt. We don't hate crystal malt. I just like to give a lot of people shit for it because we see a lot of brewers that are in their like 0th to 40th batch that just cannot get away from crystal malt. And so we're trying to beat them over the head that says, and this is like across the board. I'll see brewers that are on their like 40th, 50th batch come in with an IPA recipe, has 2 pounds of C40 in it. There's nothing really inherently wrong with crystal malts. I just see it overused, both in certain beers and
the same mistakes being made every day,
right,
over and over again.
And so that's why it has a personal hurt place in my heart, and that's why
just like, why people, why?
That's why I'm trying to give out those substitutions, and maybe in a more aggressive way than I should. But
yeah, because ultimately, I mean, golly, we've in the modern day that we live in, we have so many different malt varieties available to us.
Great flavorful malts.
And for specialty malts like that, I mean, if your local homebrew store doesn't have them, those are available online too. And picking up a 5-pound bag of stuff like that is so easy to do.
Yeah, not going to cost you much, and it's going to change your brewing game. So yeah, try out some malts. That's what we're trying to encourage you to do. There's different things to use for color than crystal malts. Mm-hmm. Not saying you have to, but you got to try it out. Yeah. I'm also liking all the coffee comments we're getting. It's a Hofbräu House, not Maxwell House. That was one of the comments.
Oh gosh. Also, collab on Wednesday we did with Natural 20 Brewing.
Yeah.
So yeah, that seemed like a busy day. I held down the fort here actually and sent you guys down there.
Yeah, we did a really nice batch there, trying out the Incognito flowable hop extract. So the goal is to see if we can get a lot of great flavors without losing volume from that. So that'll be a fun experiment just to see what we get off of it.
I hope that's not a fun experiment. I hope that's a successful experiment.
Yeah,
that was $350 worth of.
I think it was over 400.
It was not cheap.
It's a lot of hop extract. It was some expensive hop extract.
But
we also used it. We also used it in a new hazy style that we tried to brew here the day after. So same kind of concept, but we also doubled that one back through a hop back and finish it off with some red wine must.
Yeah,
so
that's going to be something crazy there.
Hopefully try to make a new style. We're aiming for like a rosé hazy IPA.
Rosé hazy juicy.
Yeah, rosé hazy.
Not really hazy because it's dark, but.
But yeah, there's haze through the purple. We can call it purple haze. Whoa.
Hashtag lawsuit. All right. Also, apparently people like us on Instagram. I don't really keep up on that. So.
Yeah, we've been trying to get out on Instagram a little bit more, and so we're in the last little over a month, we've gained about 300 followers on Instagram. So that's going really well. If you haven't already followed us on Instagram, please do so, and that's a good way to communicate with us anyway. Like if you just gotta send some questions, there's a lot fewer Instagram messages that we get than YouTube comments, and so it's sometimes easier for us to interact with you on Instagram.
Yeah, that is true. That all kind of goes through a common little thing there.
Yeah.
All right. Well, otherwise, that's our genus news. Really, only beer news I could find was that apparently the TTB, which is the Tax and Tariff Board that does a bunch of alcohol stuff, is not happy with people saying that their beers and seltzers are healthy. I don't know what they're talking about. Beer is definitely healthy.
For sure. Drink more of it.
Yeah, otherwise,
drink more beer.
Pretty quiet in the news this week. So, anyway, shall we go on to our
beer of the week? Bum, 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 beer of the week. Nailed it.
Yep. Actually, a little bit rusty on that one.
And it's been 2 weeks. By the way, Logan did actually complete a successful speed run of the Oregon Trail and set a new high score on Tetris. So he's had a good couple weeks.
Yeah. So I'm back from also. I was up there working on Starlink.
Yep.
Too. I was making sure that all went well. Space gets boring after a while.
But now we've got beer, so we're back.
So this week's beer of the week is going to be Kellerbier. It's specifically pale Kellerbier.
Category 7C.
So Kellerbier, a.k.a. a young lager, is what we're talking about today. The pale Kellerbiers are typically a base beer of actually a German Helles or something of that sort of variant. And all it really means is that these are beers that are drank young. They're not allowed the maturation time. They're not given 2 or 3 months to sit there and lager and dry up and really crisp up.
As a result, there are some notable flavor changes just from how it is fermented and aged, but we'll get at those we'll talk about those in our first topic of the week. Let's jump into the malt of the week, which is Heidi.
Yeah, so Heidelberg is a fantastic malt for any pale beer. Somebody just came in on Friday, actually, and was talking about doing a Helles. I straight up said Heidelberg all the way. It's such a clean malt that is both, it's weird, sweet and dry.
Yeah,
I don't know how to
that's a
describe
good way to put it. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's got extra flavor and texture because it is a higher protein malt, slightly lower modification malt, but because of the extra enzymes, it does its job. It's just super, super clean, and it's extra light. And so it's the only way to get that phenomenal bright yellow color. Even using 2-row will get you just a little bit past that, crisp, light lager color that you want.
Yeah, so like Peter said, yeah, it's just the flavors on there are so delicate and yet give you the malt profile you need without giving you additional sweetness, and especially for a young beer like this that you're going to have a little bit of sweetness left in there. Can't think of a better malt.
And a little bit of protein haze from the extra protein's not going to hurt nothing.
Yeah, and realistically, you're going to be using all base malt and maybe a touch of acid malt depending on your water profile for this style of beer. So really, really keep that malt bill simple.
Yep. And for our hop of the week, we went German-esque American-ish.
German-esque So our hop of the week for this style is actually going to be Mandarina Bavaria. And this is becoming more widely available now. A few years back, it was a little bit harder to get.
Yep.
But this is actually a pretty fun hop. It is a daughter of Cascade. And the best way I can describe it is it adds... It's on the sweeter side, kind of in that same wheelhouse, in my opinion, of like Nugget.
Yeah. It gives a perception of sweetness to the final beer. Obviously, it doesn't give any actual sugars, but that perception of sweetness, just how the hop plays out. And Mandarina Bavaria specifically, it also pushes forward some nice tangerine, orange kind of qualities.
Tangerine?
Some pangerine?
Pangerine, yeah.
Pangerina. Hey, when we tell you to like what we do, we're not pandering.
Oh, geez, yeah. Overall, kind of moderate to high alphas. We were talking 10 to 8%. And then same thing with the oil content. The oil content's actually surprisingly high for kind of what people think of as German hops.
Yeah.
Even though its origin is really not German. So there's that too going on. And there's a fly in my face.
Got it.
Fly in my face. Get it away.
Yeah, so it's a little bit high. I think like 2 micrograms per liter or something like that, oil content.
Yep. High myrcene, not a whole lot else. So myrcene, kind of the typical thought on that is you get some kind of grapey dank notes, but also Grampy, yeah.
Grampy dankies.
Grapey dank notes, but also this is kind of balanced by some brighter notes in the hop profile. And I think that just comes from its Cascade origin. You're getting those kind of lemon lime tones.
And all while still maintaining a semblance of that classic German grassiness without, straying from that too much. So it's still within that Kellerbier style, but hopefully with some extra funness.
By my opinion on its use, it's a balanced hop. Works really well as a single hop. If you're throwing it at New World IPAs, it can kind of get washed out. It's not quite as pungent as some other ones. But a really good kind of hop to have in the wheelhouse. Good something to throw at anything that's really light in body. I think it does well in. So
yeah, for sure. Let's go into our yeast of the week. For this beer style, you're really looking for a yeast that, first of all, can ferment relatively cleanly, relatively quickly, but also throws just subtle fruity tones, basically to help complement and boost forward the overall malt profile. So these beers should be malt leaning, and so you want kind of some yeast profile that's not going to overtake the beer, but it'll subtly push you into that nice malty feel.
Yeah, so 3470, that's our classic go-to. It's the Weihenstephan lager strain. It's going to be available. The 3470 is from Fermentus, but there's plenty of liquid strains out there, plenty of other dry strains that are just going to be under slightly different names. If you do a simple Google search on
Weihenstephan lager.
Weihenstephan lager, I'm sure they will pop up. It's a fantastic strain. Tends to actually drop out pretty nicely for me in lower ABV beers like that. So.
Yeah, and so that's going to be just for a couple of substitutes. Global for Imperial yeast and 2124 Bohemian Lager for Y yeast.
Yep. And you can also ferment this warm if you don't have temp control. So that's another wonderful aspect of this yeast.
Yeah. Fun yeasties.
All right. And lastly, let's talk a little bit about water. So like I mentioned kind of at the beginning of the beer of the week, it is usually a base beer of something in the wheelhouse of a Helles. So obviously the water is going to be on the light side when it comes to the overall profile.
Yeah, so relatively wet, light, light water profile is going to go for it. And if you want to push forward the malts just a little bit, slightly kick up the sodium and the chlorides as well.
Yeah, so we're talking overall really soft water, bicarbonate levels lower than 100 ppm if you can get them there. And then, a little bit of sodium, a little bit higher chloride to sulfate ratio, but overall quantities of all those are going to be on the low side.
Yeah.
So that is our beer of the week, I think. So.
Yeah, beer of the week. Someone is asking if we've mentioned Heidelberg malt a lot and if we can give a substitute. The closest substitute would be any light Pilsner, but what you're looking for is a slightly under-modified Pilsner. I don't know of a direct substitute for Heidelberg itself. It's just a fantastic kind of malt unique to best malts. And so it's not only because of how it's malted, but also because of how it's grown and what variety it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm going to tell you all right now, don't go and try to look for something that's going to be a substitute to it. Look for something that gets you the same flavor profile, but look for something that's unique in its own right.
Yeah, so experiment with the malts that you have that are on that same light end and try to find what works best for you. We obviously have a different selection than a lot of people. We try to usually go over malts that are semi-widely available. That said, when you're in different countries, it's kind of hard for us to know who distributes where. So
yeah. But, look for some more local maltsters, too. I know Link makes some fantastic Pilsner malts that we've experimented with.
Yeah.
That Francine malt is actually probably the closest I can think of to the Heidelberg.
Yeah. Some of them, they all should have also stats on them. So you can look at overall protein content. You can look at the diastatic power, the degree of modification. Those are all things you should be able to find from the maltster. So try to find something in the same wheelhouse.
Yeah. All right, well, let's go on to our beer topic number 1, which kind of goes right in from Kellerbier, which is young beers, how to build them up, how to drink them, what to do to make for, a nice crispy beer without having to wait forever.
Yeah, so Kellerbiers are designed to be drank young. They're designed to go through a relatively quick fermentation process, but still taste nice and clean like a light lager. The things that go along with that are flavors that are going to come along with being a semi-faster fermentation, a little bit of a messier fermentation. And the idea is that this is your classic party beer. Brewers want to be able to get these beers made and out pretty quickly and then also drank pretty quickly so they can start the process all over again.
Yeah, we're talking like 1 to 2 week turnovers.
Yeah.
So, which is actually very feasible. I have done it many times. I've done, 10-day beers.
With this exact profile, actually.
Easy. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. In fact, I do kind of a extract one that's not too far off.
Yeah.
So when it comes down to turning a beer over quickly, don't worry too much about making sure all the proteins, all the yeasts are dropped out. A little bit of haze isn't going to hurt anything. And if anything, usually these beers are going to be lower in alcohol, less than 5%. Pretty commonly, and having a little bit of that actual yeast still in suspension might add a little bit of extra flavor to the beer. And
because it's going to have a little extra yeast and or protein in there, and you're going to be sessioning on these, drinking these liters at a time, you can also count it as a meal.
Something like that. Generally fruitier in profile. Usually that comes with a slightly warmer fermentation as well. And that's going to also just kind of help build up some more flavor profile, build up some body. And these don't have to be lagers too. So for all of you that are tuning in right now, we're talking any pale beer. These can be, a blonde ale.
Super fresh fermentation.
Yeah,
anything that's going to give you the relatively neutral fermentation profile, go ahead and go with it. You're aiming for a relatively broad category. Because you're trying to kind of fire through this fermentation, one thing that's interesting about specifically the Kellerbier style is that moderate off flavors are actually acceptable.
Yeah, exactly. And that is, I guess we kind of overskipped on that actually on Kellerbier too. But we
can cover it here.
So a lot of times you can end up with some corniness, which is DMS, dimethyl sulfide. You can end up with a little bit of diacetyl, so you end up with a little bit of slickness on your tongue, and you can also end up with a little bit of acetaldehyde, depending on your yeast strain. Usually that's only if you ferment a lager yeast super warm.
Yeah.
But the acetaldehyde will give you that little bit of green apple, which, in my opinion, in moderated levels,
in small amounts,
really good.
It can actually help carry the beer and give some dimension.
Yeah.
And it goes with certain fruitinesses that can come.
Yeah, exactly.
Well.
I actually love just a little bit of that in there, and that you can usually get from if you take like a Czech Pils yeast and try to ferment that on the sort of extreme warm side. sometimes you can pull a little bit of that out of there. So yeah, and then also we got, you still want it to be bright and fresh, right?
Yeah, so you want to pick, obviously, a flavor profile with your malts that aren't going to be too cloyingly sweet.
Exactly.
One of the things that comes from malts like a lot of English-style malts, where some similar off flavors can occur, is that the malt body also carries some extra sweetness, and the yeast won't attenuate as much with the malt profile that's used, and so you can end up with a slightly sweeter beer. And once you start stacking on sweetness to any of these kind of pseudo off flavors or flavors that come from fast fermentation, it can turn a relatively drinkable beer into a beer that just sits on your palate and that you can't drink a lot of.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, yeah, so, and then also you got to realize that some of those flavors will fade out over time.
Right.
So adding these flavors at the very beginning, it almost might sound like you're, if you're listening in on this, you might say, well, that might be almost too much flavor. But as that beer actually sits, and while that first week, you're definitely going to have a lot of flavor, you're going to have a punch, even from, being in a keg or, bottle conditioning in your refrigerator from 1 week to the next, you're probably going to see a pretty significant change in the flavor profile. So do realize that ultimately you're going to end up with probably what's going to taste like a really, really crispy, clean lager.
Yeah, but since these aren't lagered, they don't go through that process, and so the overall brightness of the beer is going to change with time. So these are basically designed like lagers that are fermented a little bit faster and haven't lagered out. So that's going to be a difference between a young beer and a lagered beer. They will change with time, even in the keg, even in bottles.
Perfect, yeah. Well, I think that's pretty much all of our notes for, brewing young beers and doing, quick little turnover, easy drinking session, fresh beer. Yeah, as it kind of loops back to the whole Kellerbier, you can pretty much do this with any style of beer that you want. Only thing I would avoid are beers that are, are malt forward, and beers that are high in alcohol.
Yeah.
So
keep it light, keep it crisp, go with a high attenuating malt profile. Mash low. Probably a better way to. Probably should have said that earlier. Mash low. Right. Make it super super dry and crispy. Add some light sugars if you want to.
Yeah.
Let's grab a couple questions before going on. Someone asked, do we think 37 or 3470 is the GOAT? It's definitely one of the yeasts that we use.
It is a
most
goat.
often.
I don't know about the GOAT, but it is a GOAT.
It's definitely one GOAT. And then somebody else is asking if we use a lot of, or if heritage malts are becoming more popular in the U.S. And yes, they are.
Yep.
Especially with local or smaller scale maltsters.
For sure.
And then someone's asking, do we ever use midnight wheat from Midnight Wheat? I don't think Wireman has a midnight wheat. The only one that I know of is Breeze. We use chocolate wheat from Wireman. But midnight wheat from Breeze, I wouldn't use more than like 10% of your grain bill, kind of depending on what you're doing. It's
like food coloring.
Yeah, it can get pungent on higher doses, but
no, it's fantastic. Anything that you want to, the perfect use for me when I'm using it is in a dark beer, when I want to have that really, really deep, rich color to it, but don't want to have an overwhelming amount of roastiness that I might get from, anything else, really. So,
yeah.
Because midnight wheat is like, 500 Lovabond or something like that. So in that same range as like a Carafa 3. So really, really dark.
We did have somebody up higher saying they used in their keg of white IPA. It smells rancid now because of old hops. Should you dump it? It kind of depends on what you're tasting that's rancid. If it's that cheesiness from old hops, you might let it sit and just see if it fades away, or even just put it into a sour barrel and see if something can eat it up. If it's rancid from like infection rancid, then yeah, you should dump it.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like a good situation, unfortunately.
Genus tank tops. And the Genus tank tops, we will try to get those up on the website.
Sounds good. All right, well, let's go on to our next topic now, which is hop additions. And I think we've tried to do some videos on this in the past, but yeah, let's just kind of give you a quick breakdown of bittering versus flavoring versus dry hopping and all those good stuff.
Yeah, we realize whenever we do videos, we kind of touch on certain aspects a little bit more in depth that kind of go along with whatever video you're doing, but we've never really broken down all the hop additions in just the plainest sense in what they do, and more importantly, probably how they're different on the home scale than they are on the commercial scale, because a lot of what you're thinking about is going backwards from the time it takes you to chill down your beer, basically.
Yep. So yeah, obviously, I think the one that everybody is actually familiar with out there that's probably watching this is going to be your bittering edition. This is, I like to say, anything that is boiled for more than 30 minutes.
Yeah.
And this can be literally 30 all the way up to 2 hours if you really want to get crazy. With that said, you always the 60-minute number is actually there for a reason. It's because you tend to get your best bang for a buck because your utilization rate actually drops significantly. So if you boil something for 2 hours instead of 1 hour, you're not actually getting double the bitterness. Your extraction rate, I guess, goes down, and that's why generally that 60 minutes is where everybody settles.
Yeah. And if you're using a lower alpha hop, so you have to use a lot of it for your total bitterness with your 60-minute edition, you can actually run the risk of getting grassiness with too long of a boil. So let's say you're using like Saaz for your bittering. There's no reason to use that for a 90-minute edition.
Yeah. Our lovely term that we say aggro.
Yeah, it's a little aggro.
Which is, English styles. It's some that's a little bit more appropriate than others.
Yeah.
With that said, though, I think both you and I are always like to err on the side of, even if something says to use 2 ounces of a low alpha bittering hop, we'll kind of be like, or we can use ½ ounce of this super high alpha hop.
Saves money and makes a cleaner beer.
Yep. Ultimately, that is what you end up with. So. Okay, and so now what happens, though, when we hit that 30-minute mark, generally between about 10 minutes and 30 minutes, those are what we kind of call, or what you'll commonly see called our flavoring additions, right?
So there are some depths of flavor that you get from these, and really recipes are hard to judge. And this is one of the reasons that I think recipes it's nicer if you can learn enough so you can pull away from recipes a little bit, because they have a standard set addition for every flavoring addition, a standard set time, whether that's 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. And a lot of recipes were built off the notion that you can chill within 10 to 15 minutes. So that chill time is kind of what they're working backwards with, and that's important because that first 212 down to about 180 to 190 degrees, in that range, you're still isomerizing alpha acids. There's still some volatilization of oils, meaning there's still some oils that will off-gas. And so if it takes you a long time to chill, or if you're doing no chill, you really have to take into account that a 10-minute edition is a lot more like a 30-minute edition, and a 15-minute edition can become a bittering edition.
Yeah, exactly. So you do have to always consider your chilling times. I know everybody's chilling times are going to vary. I know your method of chilling actually can vary a lot. So whether you're using an immersion chiller or whether you're using a counterflow chiller makes a big difference.
Yeah, it's whether or not you've got everything cooling down at the same time, or whether or not you've got part of it cooling all the way down and the rest of it staying hot.
I know back home when I switched up to a counterflow, man, my bitterness just dropped out of the bottom.
Yeah.
The beers I brewed dropped by, a good 20 to 30%. And when it came to perceived bitterness of the beer. So that's also something to consider. And that's usually where you actually see people doing their Whirlpool editions in their hop stands.
Yeah.
I think is a lot of times when you have people that have a counterflow chiller. And that's because you're dropping beer from boiling down to 70 degrees in a single pass, whereas you're kind of being more gradual with an immersion chiller.
Yeah, and so immersion chillers are a little bit easier to kind of hit the nail on the head. And a lot of times an immersion chiller, if it's big enough, you're still kind of working with that 15-minute chill time if you've got semi-cool groundwater. So you're immediately going below that 200 degrees or that 212 degrees when you turn it on too. So
yeah,
some slight differences there. What I would say, what we like to err with in a lot of things is we don't worry too much about what we put into those flavoring additions, just because when we're building recipes, we know that there's such a dramatic degree of difference that people have with the beers that they make. And so a lot of times what we'll do is we'll actually work with things that are later than 10 minutes, or we'll do hop stands at different temperatures. And so we might say, before you start chilling at all, turn off your water, do a hop stand, and then start chilling.
Yeah, and that kind of gives you a little bit more control. It gives gives us a sense of well, we at least know they're starting at this point, right?
Right.
And that's that's just something that you're gonna have to find out on your own system, what works best for you, what works best for your beers. Ultimately, here we use we brew very few beers that have these 10 to 30 minute additions. The only ones I can really think of are actually some of the lighter beers, some of our, more traditional German lagers that we might throw in a 15 or 20 minute addition on.
That'll be a relatively small hop profile.
So, yeah, exactly. And those beers, we're hopping at lower rates anyway. They're definitely not something in IPAs. It's more or less a waste.
Yeah, so I mean that's a general rundown of the majority of hop additions that people are pretty familiar with and see a lot, and we like to basically minimize the impact of these additions wherever we can, just because they can kind of vary. And so, like I said, when it comes to the bittering addition, we like to just kind of hit it with a small amount of hops just to get up to whatever we need to bitter to, and that's usually the last thing that we calculate. We usually kind of try to calculate all our other.
We don't worry about it after that.
Yeah,
it's the numbers will fall into place when you know what kind of hops you're throwing at it.
Yeah. Well, let's go into flame out, because that's one that I think is pretty commonly misunderstood. So your flame out or your 0 minute addition,
your knockout addition,
right?
Your it's under many different names, but ultimately it just means that you are adding hops, and usually in a high quantity of hops, right when you stop adding heat to your kettle.
Yeah, and so these are hops that are designed to stay in the liquid after, obviously, the boil and during chill. So when you're chilling with an immersion chiller, that's the best way to consistently gauge what you're getting with a flame out addition. So your 0 minute addition goes in right when you take the kettle off the heat, and then that hop remains in during the immersion chiller, chilling the entire batch of beer down.
Yeah. So, and then this can actually be benefited a lot by adding a pump to your system. Because as soon as you stop the boil, you stop that sort of rolling cycle of the beer, so you don't have your hops, being circulated around. So at this point, I really recommend, if you start adding a lot of flame out additions, try to add some kind of a pump to your system to recirculate. If you don't have a pump, what I used to do was I would kind of take my flame out and I would actually add them at like 1 or 2 minutes. Just give it a minute, just so that those hops, because they're pellets, right?
Yeah.
So just give it a
really
minute to break up those pellets, to kind of soak up and get kind of moved around a little bit before I kill the heat. But yeah, otherwise, those are probably going to have some of the biggest flavor punches of all additions that we're going to be adding to beer, right?
And they're usually designed, so flame outs are better, more easily calculated. They're better designed for beers that you're chilling faster, i.e. beers that the chill time is going to be that 10 to 15 minute chill time. Mm-hmm. That once those hops are soaked up, and especially if you've got a pump recirculating through them, you're going to get the maximum absorption of those hops, but also you're not really having to worry about when to calculate how long they're taking in the boil, or how long they're taking to get used up.
Yeah.
So they're the counter to a flame out. If you don't have that exact fast chill time, if you don't know how long, we usually start recommending doing what's called a hop stand, which is just a different way to calculate the approach to getting your hops squeezed into your beer.
Yeah. So if you have a immersion chiller, like we talked about earlier, more or less the flame out addition, you can throw that in. You can turn your chiller on. 15 minutes later, you're going to drop right down through that range. You're going to be probably well below, actually, 170 degrees within about 15 minutes. And you're going to get all the goodness from those hops. You're going to get some utilization when it comes to bitterness from those hops.
Yep.
Most people don't realize that the calculators will tell you 0. Realistically, you're getting about 10% utilization from them. And then you're going to go down through that range. You're going to avoid extracting too much grassiness, too much of that chlorophyll flavor. But then if you don't have that nice, predictable,
temperature drop
of temperature, then the hop stand is definitely going to be the way to go for you. And all that is it's stopping it somewhere along the path of that, boiling down to 170, 160 even degrees.
Yeah.
And basically just letting the beer sit for 10 or 15 minutes, right?
So what we like to tell people when it comes to doing hop stands is calculate it from how long you want the hops to sit in at a certain temperature. So let's say you kill the heat and then you chill the beer down just a little bit, and then you stop chilling at, say, 200 to 205 degrees, and then throw in your flame out addition. That's an easy way, if you're going to be chilling really slowly, to first of all know that you're not going to volatilize the hop oils, because it's not all the way up at a boiling temperature, but still you can get a nice soak of what you would intend from that flame out addition, or from that 0-minute addition. So a soak at 200 degrees is still going to give you a lot of flavor and a decent amount of aroma, especially if you can close off that lid and make sure it sticks there, but still maximizing your absorption, and let it free fall down a couple more degrees. The biggest hop stand that we'll do is actually closer to 180 to 190 degrees though, because if you're using really fruity, especially New World hops, that boosts a lot of tropical aromas and flavors.
Yeah, because those same oils that are aroma oils, I call them oils. I guess they are oils.
They're oils, volatile oils.
They're so they're very, very volatile. What I always say is that if you throw hops in your boil kettle, and as you're boiling, the beer smells amazing like an IPA, that's actually a bad thing, because that means that all of those oils are actually being boiled off, and you're losing them when you actually want those to stay in the beer until you pour that pint.
Yep.
So yeah, dropping that temperature down will keep a lot more of those oils in solution. It'll keep them in the beer through the fermentation. And then ultimately that's what you smell when you drink the beer in the end process.
So yeah, a lot of times when you do hop stands, we'll recommend each temperature that you're aiming for no more than like 20 minutes, especially at the hotter end of that temperature scale. And for the whole set of chilling down through different hop stands, you really don't want to be going much more than like 40 minutes total.
Yeah. So during this time, whirlpooling is another term that you're going to hear thrown out there. And all that is it just means if you've got a pump, you've got it set to recirculate through your kettle. If you don't have a pump, you can actually do the same thing by just stirring it with a spoon and just creating that little circular motion in your kettle. This is also going to help bring some of the proteins and the hops towards the middle of your kettle, and you kind of form a nice ball so you get clear wort going into your fermenter. But on top of that, it's going to help extract more flavor from those hops. Again, it's just that process of you're physically moving them around in the beer.
Yeah, so you benefit in two ways. You're maximizing that utilization. You're maximizing the efficacy of your hops by making sure that they're getting that full soak in your beer with the motion. And then depending on the shape and size of your kettle and how it's made, that spinning can actually serve to reduce both the protein material and the hop material that gets into your fermenter, which is going to be good for reducing any chance of grassiness. Now, this doesn't work for every style of kettle, especially a lot of the coffee can style.
The wider the bottom, the better it works for sure.
Yeah, so the tall ones like the Anvil, the Mash and Boil, the Robo Brew, the Grainfather, all those, some sort of filtration mechanism is going to be the best way to get that hop and protein break out. Whether that be a mesh screen post kettle as you're going into your fermenter, or whether that just means you are bagging your hops, and when you recirculate through that bag, so that bag is picking up the hop material and the proteins. Those are going to be the two ways to kind of forego what you would have to do or what you would be getting out of a whirlpool.
Yeah. And then finally on the whirlpool, like Peter said, dropping down through that temperature level again. We've had some really great success doing two different temperatures during that whirlpool, stopping once at that higher end, that 180, 170 degree mark, but then actually stalling for just 5 or 10 minutes down at about 140 degrees. And perhaps even adding a second, hop addition at that time.
Yeah, a smaller hop addition, but yeah. Cryo hops are great at that because they'll absorb faster.
Exactly, yeah, and adding a smaller hop addition and then letting that cool down the rest of the way. While you're not getting nearly as much flavor pulled from the second hop addition, you can get different flavors, and that's really the whole point of why we will do that and why we do the whirlpool additions, which more or less are the same thing as a hop stand.
Through all that, we've got somebody asking, doesn't keeping the beer at 180 or so for a long time after the boil increase the risk of infection? No, not at 180. At 140, if you're in an open kettle, there's a small risk. There are some thermophilic bacteria that can live above 140, not many, but 180 is pasteurization temperature. You can pasteurize at 180.
Yeah.
So a lot of times when you're doing like a raw ale, you'll actually see people bring their beer up to about 170 to make sure it's pasteurized before dropping it back down. But
170 and not much is living after that.
Yeah.
At least not within it's a matter of seconds is all it takes to kill things.
Yeah, unless you got like a water bear in there.
A tardigrade?
Yeah, tardigrade.
Because our beer's going to get infected with tardigrades?
I don't know. You might be eating a tardigrade.
We could call it tardigrada, so. Actually, I still want to get that shirt. There's a shirt, and it's got a tardigrade with a bunch of beer bottles that says partygrada. Anyway, we're not getting distracted here.
What?
So let's go on to dry hopping now, which is...
Oh, send us a picture of a tardigrade if you like them.
Yeah, send us a meme or something. I don't know.
I don't know. We want our Instagram to blow up with tardigrade memes. We'll post them all to our stories. Get on it, guys.
So that's it for your brew day. Your
He says we watch too much Octonauts.
What's wrong with Octonauts?
Yeah, you're not wrong.
Octonauts at ease until the next
Adventure.
adventure. Woo! Okay.
Let's talk about dry hopping, guys.
Yeah, dry hopping.
I don't know why we haven't gotten onto this topic a little sooner.
So dry hopping. So day 3, day 2 even sometimes. Your beer's at high Krausen. It is tearing through those sugars. You pitched an awesome pack of juice from Imperial or something in there, and we're gonna throw some hops in it. So why are we doing this, Peter?
So what you're aiming for with a pack of hops at high Krausen or during active fermentation is biotransformation. Biotransformation is actually relying on your yeast to cleave aromatic compounds that are attached to sugars within the hops, and so you get a little extra sugar, negligible for the alcohol percentage in the beer, but you're also opening up some aromatic compounds that can give you some subtle grapefruit and citrus, as well as a little bit of like peachy tropicalness.
Yeah, exactly. So the whole point of a biotransformation hop is that you're getting different aromatic compounds. You're changing really the aromatic compounds that are found in hops into different, into a more fruity profile, I guess. So if your whole goal
less aggressive
is to make a hazy, then that's where biotransformation hopping came into play. With that said, you do have to consider the fact that you are going to add a really usually heavy amount of hops. This might be 4 to 6 ounces for a 5-gallon batch, and if you're using standard pelletized hops or anything that's not a cryo hop or a lupulin hop, then you need to have some kind of a way to get those hops back out of the beer, because you usually don't want them sitting in there for the 10 to 14 days that otherwise is gonna take to transfer that beer into a keg.
You a little like bug zapper for that guy.
I know there's like one fly flying around. It's just like being really annoying this morning.
I'm gonna eat him, I swear.
No, you probably shouldn't do that.
Yeah. So anyways, so you want to be able to either, for us, that means going from fermenter to keg a little bit early, even if your beer is not completely done. But we try to aim for that 3 to 4 days after a biotransformation dry hop to get that beer into final package. That way, even if the beer is not done completely fermenting, you actually get a little bit of spunding effect, meaning you're going to get some CO2 captured in your keg just from extra fermentation, and then you're also reducing the risk of actually off-gassing any of the hop oils. And so if you have it in a closed vessel, then there's nowhere else for the hop oils to go. They stay in the keg, and your beer stays fresher a little bit longer, and also those first pours will be extra aromatic.
Yeah. Otherwise, if you do have conical fermenters, you can always dump these hops out the bottom. Bagging is generally not recommended, because in order to remove them, you're obviously going to have to open up your kettle. And for brewing hazies, fermenter.
Yeah.
And for brewing hazies, that's never a good idea. You're introducing more oxygen. Usually, by the time you remove them, you're not going to have a really vigorous fermentation going on. So that's not something that we typically would recommend around here. If you can, dump them out the bottom, push them out with some CO2. Otherwise, like Peter said, it might just mean that you have to sort of transfer it straight into, I don't know what, you can call it a conditioning keg, I guess, after, day 6, day 7.
Yeah, and then you can use that as basically a bright tank, and then move it into your final serving keg, low dough, under pressure after that.
So yeah, if you've got some spare cornies, they work well for that. Fermentation is going to be mostly complete by then. All you're going to do is let it condition in that keg for another week or so, and let all your yeasties drop out, so that while your beer might be hazy, it won't be chewy.
Right. And somebody's asking if we transfer twice. If we're using our corny keg as a bright tank, then yeah, that's an intermediate tank, and we do a second transfer after that into a serving tank. So the nice thing about that is you're still keeping everything under pressure, so it's still keeping the aromatic oils from the hops from volatilizing or evaporating off. You keep it all under pressure so it stays in the beer, and then you low-dough transfer into your final serving keg, which means you can get them off the hops, reduce the risk of any plant material making your beer a little bit too bitey.
Yeah.
And then you also get to spund a little bit, and so you get a little bit of CO2 capture.
Yeah. The only downside to doing it that way is make sure that you have 100% confidence in the cleanliness of all your equipment, because you do end up having a higher risk of introducing contamination and introducing infection in the beer. So just really make sure that you're not one of those people that's like, I think this keg's clean, or something like that, because hazies are expensive beers too.
Yeah.
So you definitely don't want to ruin them. And then also kind of always have that awareness of, even in your transferring equipment, you're transferring hoses, not only to make sure those are clean, but even making sure those are purged with a little bit of CO2 before you hook them up, because even that little bit of oxygen in a 2-foot piece of jumper hose can be enough to have significant impacts on a hazy. So
Yeah.
Anyway, well, let's go on to our traditional dry hop, right? So now we're going to jump a few more days down the fermentation process. Let's say it's a week to 10 days out. Your beer's pretty much done fermenting.
Nice and dry and clean.
Yeah, your yeast is starting to drop out. And that's when we usually add our traditional dry hop. And that's going to give you another just great big aroma bomb. You're not getting actually a lot of flavor so much as you're getting aroma from that. And you're going to leave that in there for, I like to say, 3 or 4 days.
Yeah.
I've heard fantastic success of 24-hour dry hopping, which for a hazy might not be the end of the world,
Only if you can get that maximized contact area. So it's not going to work as well if things are bagged or contained in some way. But yeah, traditional dry hop is going to be 3 to 4 days in the fermenter, just to make sure you maximize the oils dissolving into your beer. If you're doing a traditional dry hop, so there's no yeast activity during that time, you have, first of all, you have the risk of hop creep. You want to make sure that your yeast at least can do enough to clean up any VDKs, that's going to be diacetyl or pentane-dione, that can be created by hop creep. But overall, you're going to get a brighter and a little bit more aggressive, like citrus, acidic flavor out of that dry hop than you would out of a biotransformation dry hop.
Yeah, because it does, when you do that dry hop, from the research I've read, it does actually typically raise the pH of the beer a little bit, which increases the perceived bitterness, which is kind of another interesting thing. And that's always a trick if you've got beer that's tasting a little sweet side. Hit it with some dry hops, and it'll feel like it's dried out on you. And then lastly, let's talk about adding hops. In fact, I saw a comment on it, so this is perfect timing. But adding hops like directly to the keg, or adding hops after you've cold crashed.
So 2 things it's going to do. First of all, it's going to overall brighten the beer and brighten the flavor extraction that you get from your hops. So usually you're going to get a more direct flavor from the hops, of what the hops would perceive as if you were just opening up the bag if you're doing this style of dry hop. It also allows, it slows down the hops from getting that plant matter flavor, because the plant matter flavor actually comes from micro oxidative effects that happen in the hops. So it slows that down from happening because the beer is colder, so it takes longer for you to get that grassy flavor. But the downside to a cold crashed dry hop is that hop creep can still risk VDKs depending on your yeast.
Yeah, and when you're in a keg too, this might mean that you end up with an overcarbonated keg. We have actually experienced that in one of our more recent batches of beer, and that was also because we were kind of pushing it out a little bit too fresh, probably. Yep. If there is such a thing. But yeah, hop creep is definitely a thing when you got the stuff on the cold side, because those enzymes in the hops can actually create a little bit more available sugars for the yeast, and so you get this really kind of slow, extended fermentation from adding a lot of hops to it. Typically, this isn't going to be an issue if you're adding, a small amount of hops. Say if you're adding an ounce per 5-gallon batch, you're not really going to see this, or at least you shouldn't see this. But if you're adding a 4 or 5 ounce addition, it's definitely something to be aware of. And unfortunately, other than just making sure your beer is fully attenuated before you crash it, there's not a whole lot that you can do about it.
I called the crashed dry hop making crispy boys.
Making crispy.
They can taste really bright and really good with a crashed dry hop. But
yeah. So the question that somebody had about this was actually, how we add our hops to the keg, if we're going to do it.
There's a couple of questions like that, actually.
And so typically we've used little torpedo tubes in the past. those don't work the best with your traditional pellet hops, but with cryo hops or your lupulin powder stuff, those actually do work really well. The beauty of that is that we've actually just left them in a corny keg the entire, throughout drinking the entire batch, and it's kind of fun because it takes a few days to infuse, and then it actually changes as you drink the beer as well. So that's kind of a really fun way to do that. You can put only an ounce or two max, I think, in those torpedo tubes, but if you're using cryo hops, that's usually plenty.
Yeah, a lot of those you'd only do an ounce. But with cryo hops, that's plenty. But the downside is it's reducing the surface area, so it's reducing the solubility or the contact flowability through of the hops, and so you're not getting as much out of them. We've seen a lot of times where we've done a dry hop like that, the hops puff up and expand to the sides of the screens, and then when we actually go to empty it out, the insides of that will still be completely dry. So we know we're not maximizing what we're getting off those hops. So we like to be able to use something that's a little bit oversized. They actually make mesh canisters that work pretty well if you just weigh them down and throw the hops in there. That are a little bit bigger, but
yeah, and I would do, if you want to have that consistent flavor, I would probably do the same technique. Maybe add that to, if you plan on transferring to a keg really young and using that as a conditioning keg, maybe add those hops into that conditioning keg and then transfer off of that into your final serving keg. That's probably the best method to do it. Otherwise, I definitely recommend against adding straight pellet hops to a keg. I've done that before. It's a bad idea. Won't do it anymore.
Yeah.
I blew beer all over my wall.
And you can
don't tell my wife.
Yeah, and you can clog your dip tubes and stuff.
Yeah,
like that.
That's exactly what happened. Yeah, you will clog your dip tube. You'll end up with hop material all over the place. It's a bad idea.
We did miss one hop addition that I kind of just forgot to add, and that's a hop back. Hop backing is actually an addition that we do in all our juicy/hazies. What that is something that goes in line from your kettle, between your kettle and your chiller usually, or sometimes you can hook it up after your chiller with a different effect. But what it does is it makes it so that you can kind of send hops one directional through or your beer one direction through a set of hops, get maximized contact and utilization through the beer, and then also set it through at a different temperature than you would if you were doing a whirlpool or a hop stand, so you can get some extra juicy flavors that way.
Yeah.
It also serves to clarify the beer a little bit. It can pick up some proteins. So the hop stand or hop back is another really great hopping technique that we use, but it does take some specialized equipment.
Yep, definitely so. But yeah, you can definitely get some really nice infusion from them. I noticed the notes tend to be more floral actually from using a hop back, and maybe that's just because you're using whole leaf hops versus pellets. But yeah, no, another kind of fun tool to add to the arsenal.
Someone asked hop Randall. I'm not a huge fan of Randalls, honestly, especially with hops. You get like that first burst of like 3 or 4 really good pints, and then they just kind of go flat afterwards.
It's the consistency of them. That's the. I think what we need to do is we need to do like a video on how to do a Randall right and actually do it with a 5-gallon keg.
Yeah.
like modify a whole corny keg to be a Randall, and that's probably the better way to do it, because then you get a much slower movement of the beer through the Randalls generally as a rule, they're so small that you have a huge variance in what kind of flavor you're pulling from them from pint to pint.
For a 5-gallon batch, does it matter more on the length of time hops are steeped or the type of hop itself, alpha acid percentage, to reduce grassy off flavors and keep the aromas you want? A couple things with that. Alpha acid percentage can, with the hop steeping time, a long hot steep with a high alpha acid percentage can get you almost a scorched flavor. Not exactly the same as grassy, but almost a scorched flavor. The amount of time is more likely to get you the grassy flavor, and then it's exaggerated even more if those hops are slightly old or even a little bit oxidized.
Yeah, I worry more about the time than the alphas. You're always going to have high alpha hops if you're doing anything like that anyway. So, yeah, definitely worry about the time. Worry about the sheer volume of hops. I haven't really ran into this issue when I'm having, a hopping rate of 2 ounces, 3 ounces per 5-gallon batch. It's when we get up into those half pound, 12 ounces, a pound per 5-gallon batch. That's when you have to start being, much more wary of that and actually being like, well, maybe we shouldn't let that sit for too long. 4.5 pounds for 5-gallon batch.
Yeah, we've only done that once.
That got a little vegetal.
A little bit. It's still good.
Yeah, surprisingly, not as much as I would have expected.
Yeah.
Like for like making hop soup.
Right. Would you recommend whirlpooling with cryo hops or just keep it to dry hopping? I recommend whirlpooling with cryo hops. So what I like to do is I like to have, whenever I can in Whirlpool or dry hop, all of that I'll keep to cryos. With the exception of with a Whirlpool, sometimes I like to have a little bit of pellets just for, there is something extra that you get with plant matter. That said, you run higher risks when that plant matter is this half pound per 5 gallons. And so a little bit of that plant matter, but with the rest cryo hops, anything Whirlpool and later is kind of my go-to.
And for those of you that are now wondering, we are opening things up to a general questioning now. That sums it up for our topics.
Yeah, we're pretty much done with topics.
So, and let's go on to our next question, which is somebody's asking, again, about the Philly Sour. And we have not used it yet. We have not done a biotransformation hopping edition yet with it, but it's on our way, right?
Yeah, it's on the way.
Yeah.
I haven't actually looked into what the Philly Sour does for biotransformation, because there are different levels of biotransformation. All hops will biotransform, for the record. Some people don't think they do. All yeasts will biotransform, but some have a specialty enzyme in them that does it slightly differently than others. So, but we will be playing with the Philly Sour. More on that to come.
Was there glycol last week? I didn't watch last week's.
Yeah, I had glycol last week.
Oh, okay. That's good.
That's my drink. I usually drink glycol.
Oh, okay.
Remember?
Advice for wet hop beers. That's actually a really great question, a very timely question.
Get a giant kettle that's next to your first kettle. Throw your all the way done being boiled wort into that kettle, and then strain it back off into your fermenter through a chiller.
For every ounce of pellet hops you would put in a beer, typically use
5
a
ounces
pound of wet hops.
Yeah, 5 ounces minimum.
A pound.
Okay.
A pound. Go for it.
Sure.
You got to go for it. It's the only way to do it. I've done it personally a half dozen times, and every single time it turns out fantastic. Also, overshoot your batch size. There was somebody in here yesterday. Plan for a 6-gallon batch. You will end up with 5 gallons.
Maybe 4. Yeah, you'll lose a lot, even though it is wet hops. You'll still lose some to absorption. You got to understand that. But yeah, so with wet hops, the other thing that I would say is you have to know the source of the hops. If it's hops from your backyard, no matter what varietal they are not the varietal that you buy in the store. They're usually lower total oil and higher the things that make it taste grassy. So even with a lot of it, you'll end up getting a slightly grassier flavor, which is good if you build your beer around that and just expect this is going to be a grassier version of what I'm getting when I'm regular hopping. But yeah, everything in the Whirlpool, everything
more
late.
Delicate, more floral too.
Don't bitter with it. So
everything goes in the Whirlpool.
Yeah,
that is a good point. I failed to mention that. Don't boil any of the hops. Add them all to the Whirlpool. Throw them in there. Try to get them cooled off again. Like we mentioned earlier, within 10 or 15 minutes if you can. Cool them off a little faster than you normally would. Hop at a rate of 1 pound per gallon. Sounds crazy. It's not. And you'll end up with a really delicious beer in the end.
Yeah. Okay, so
going back down now I did it. Going back down the line, I've got Tobias is wondering about 4.5% low ABV New England IPAs and whether or not they're going to taste the same as lower ones, or not lower, bigger ones when it comes to ABV. And if they do, you work some brewing magic, because those are typically big, chewy beers, and they're like that for a reason. They've got loads and loads of grains in them that are giving you that chewiness. So a session one, I would definitely think is going to be lighter on the body, which, in my opinion, isn't a bad thing. So I would not expect them to taste the same.
First of all, before we go on, there are 118 of you watching live. If you could please give us a thumbs up, that helps us out tremendously when these live streams finish. But let's go on to. We already answered this, but I'll kind of rehash it. Can you guys explain why you hate crystal malts so much? So we talked about this at the beginning of the live stream. We don't actually really hate crystal malts that much. They're not going to ruin your beer. They're not going to make your beer taste bad. The reason that we bag on them a lot is to be a little bit divisive, a little bit purposely argumentative, to push people away from using them as often as they do, because we see thousands and thousands of brewers every year. We see, probably multiple thousands of recipes every single year, and a lot of people get stuck in this rut of having to use crystal malts in a lot of their beers. And so anytime we can push people away from using crystal malts, we want to open people up to the idea that it's going to help give them better depth of flavor, more complexity, and a lot more options to manipulate what they can brew if we push them away from crystal malts.
Yeah. That, and, like any flavors that you're going to have, not just in beer, but, think of food in general. You've got the flavor wheels, you've got like sweet and sour work together, right? And there's certain things that work together, and generally the sweetness that you get from crystal malts, or at least in high quantity, does not work with a lot of the fruitiness that you get from hops. And that's why, we see so many recipes coming in, and they're trying to throw a whole lot of these New World fruity hops at a beer, and then they're throwing a whole lot of crystal malt, and then they come back and they're like, yeah, my beer was good, but it's kind of sweet. And it's like, well, yeah, that's because you got conflicting flavors in there. And so, yeah, it's one of the things of just balancing flavors, understanding how flavors work. You don't want to throw a peach in with a bunch of teriyaki. Like, it's just going to end up being weird.
I feel like that can go well. Peach and teriyaki.
All right. Well, maybe Peter thinks it'll go well, but yeah, it's just one of those things of just trying to balance flavors out. Hey, somebody super chatted us. Thank you.
Thank you, Esteban. Just wanted to say thank you for the knowledge while I'm drinking coffee on Sunday morning.
Heck yeah.
Cheers to that. I appreciate you.
My cup's empty. Otherwise, I'd cheer. All right, what was the next question here?
Have we ever used hop oils, and what are our thoughts on them? So for hop oils, they can be hit and miss. They're a great tool, but first of all, the one that we used most recently, the Incognito, is supposedly highly flowable and highly soluble. So this is going to be on the most usable end of the spectrum for any brewer. And even that one was kind of tough to get all dissolved into the beer.
Yeah, I know the first one we did, we had a heck of a time trying to dissolve it in beer.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the fact that they're so thick. That's the main issue that you have. I think they're best used as a 16-minute addition for boiling, honestly.
A lot of them.
Yeah.
The ones that you're trying to get flavor on, you need to whirlpool first of all. You need some sort of technique to make sure you're maximizing that contact and infusion, and they need to be in there for a good amount of time. So the Incognito, for example, we threw that in the whirlpool both times, and it was whirlpooling for a total of about 30 minutes, just to make sure that we got that high contact time.
Yeah, you want to make sure that gets dissolved. It is an oil, so it's obviously not designed to be dissolved.
Not water loving.
Yeah, so that is the sort of crux of the situation that you run into there, is that you're trying to get something to dissolve that really does not want to dissolve. So yeah, either adding them as a boiling addition if you can get some cheaper stuff. If you spend the big money on us like we did, you're going to want to do really long extended whirlpools. And I think that's the best way to get your buck's worth out of them. Paul is asking about Super Clear, and he said he added it to a Pilsner and he turned it into a hazy, which is kind of the opposite of what you want to do. But I have a theory on this.
Okay.
I'm guessing he added it to his keg, or added it. I don't know. Maybe he added it to. I'm guessing he added it to a keg, and he's pulling pints off of the bottom of his keg right now.
Oh, maybe.
And I'm guessing the Super Clear is doing what it's supposed to. However, because you're pulling from the bottom of the keg, you're actually pulling all of that stuff out first. So I have a feeling, keep drinking your beer, and it will eventually become very, very bright very, very quickly on you once you get to that level of as that stuff's dropping out. So.
Hopefully. Yeah, I'm trying to think of anything else that it could be. Obviously chill haze, depending on what proteins are in the beer. I know if you use a high protein Pilsner base malt, then chill haze could just be there. But that said, the Super Clear should clear all that protein haze up. If you added just the second part of the Super Clear, then that could not pull out the proteins, because one of them's going to pull out proteins and one of them's going to drop yeast, basically.
Yeah. The other thing, too, is if you end up shaking something up after you add it, you can actually get that back up into suspension. So.
But it'll drop back out eventually. As long as it's blobbed into big enough molecules that are heavy, they're going to settle to the bottom.
Yeah. We got...
Ooh, here's a good one. Well, actually, first let's address thoughts on 3470 compared to Diamond Lager from Lallemand or Bavarian Lager from Mangrove Jack. We haven't used Diamond Lager or Bavarian Lager. But from our experience, pretty much anything that's the fine stuff in lager, if they are analogs, they work pretty identical.
Yeah.
Do a big starter all the time, and it'll work out well.
Yeah, I don't see anything wrong with either one of those. Bavarian Lager, I don't know is that the Weihenstephan strain?
We get confused with nomenclature on that because Bavarian Lager and Mangrove Jacks.
Yeah.
In Y Yeast, Bavarian Lager is not the Weihenstephan Lager strain.
So
yeah,
I want to say that's probably a different strain, but don't quote me on it.
Yeah, I'd have to look it up just to be sure. But
yeah, somebody's asking us if we grow hops. No, not anymore.
Yeah, we used to.
They tried to take over the world.
Yeah. How to dry hop with a hop bullet, corny keg with closed system. Does a CO2 purge with star san stain flavor? So I'm guessing that means like using something like a hop back or a hop rocket and flowing your beer through that from the corny keg. First of all, if you were to do that, it could work as long as it's fully purged with CO2 before. And then the two ways to do it would be either with a diaphragm pump, so it can remain a closed system, and pump through for a couple days, which would actually be my preferred method. Again, as long as the hops are in the hop rocket or hop back or hop bullet, whatever. And then that is very, very fully purged with nitrogen or CO2. And then the other would be if you had a bigger canister, something that's closer to a gallon size, honestly, even a small keg, you could throw your hops into there as a dry hop, again, as long as it is fully purged with CO2 or nitrogen. And then flow your beer, push your beer into that keg for, a couple hours a day, something like that, and then just push it back with CO2.
All right. Going through some more questions. I am catching up here. We'll probably just answer a few more questions here because
someone asks who guys want to get some pizza.
Who guys want to get pizza? I mean,
yeah,
it's next door. I'm always down. What
about adding fruit and dry hopping? I wanted to add fruit near the end of fermentation. I was thinking about letting it sit on that for a week. Yeah, I just would make sure you're not letting it sit on the hops for that long. So you can add fruit and then it'll kick up a new fermentation. You might get some biotransformation at that same time. But I usually do that in 2 stages, honestly. It kind of depends on if you're trying to sweeten the beer, but
yeah, I
would almost add the dry hops first as a biotransformation and then transfer it into something else on fruit.
So we got Jeff is asking how long you would condition a beer after a big dry hop session, what variables to account for, and when to determine how long to condition for. Ooh, so this is all going to depend on really the beer you're brewing, the style of beer it is. I'm guessing it's some form of an IPA. But yeah, get it off of those dry hops definitely within 5 or 6 days max. Like we've mentioned in the past, 3 or 4 days is usually ideal. And then as for conditioning, for a hazy, that might be, a matter of honestly just a few days. For something more like a West Coast or a Northwest, you might be looking at, 2 to 3 weeks when that beer really peaks out in the sort of hop profile that it's producing for you. So that's my answer to that question. Otherwise,
is there a certain way to push butterscotch flavor of diacetyl and not buttered popcorn flavor to create a butter beer, or would schnapps into the keg be better? Schnapps into the keg.
Schnapps in the keg. I was gonna say butterscotch flavor.
Just get rid of diacetyl.
It's not a good thing to have in your beer. You don't want to purposely have it in there.
Yeah, it's very difficult to control the amount or what it comes across as.
Yeah, and
it's slick too. It feels.
Yeah. And if you're brewing right,
wrong.
You should never actually have issues with it. So, all right. Somebody's asking about options for the floating dip tubes, whether or not they're any good for kegs. I think floating dip tubes have their purpose. I think for most situations they're not necessary, but if you ever want to do a real ale, so cask conditioned beer, you can actually do that in your corny keg. Best way to do that is to actually, if you have the room, to turn your corny keg at kind of on its side or at a 45. And then I think that's a fantastic use for those floating dip tubes because you are going to end up with a lot of sediment in there from that natural conditioning. And then the floating dip tubes allow you to, drink the cleaner beer that's going to be on the top and not just be picking up tons of sediment all the time. So I think that's the best use for those guys.
Is 1.5 pounds of lactose too much for a 5-gallon batch of milkshake sour IPA? Nope, it's not too much. We usually stick right around there probably for sour milkshake IPAs.
5 pounds.
Yeah, we've seen people do up to 2 pounds, which I think 2 pounds is probably too much, but 1.5 pounds is within range.
Yeah, no, it's that's not going to be overwhelmingly sweet by any standard. So,
Best way to hop a beer kit. Get more hops and add it to the Whirlpool or hop stand.
yeah, find the freshest hops you can and add them late. That's for sure the way to do it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that pretty much sums it up. We do have to get open, but thank you everyone for tuning in today. Hopefully we will see you all next week on our live stream. We do this every week at 8:45 Pacific Standard Time.
Yeah.
Did we say 9:45 at the beginning of this?
No, we said 8:45.
Okay.
100%. Thank you again to Esteban Flemons for the super chat. We really appreciate it. Helps keep us motivated to get these things out every week.
All right. And always feel free, if you are tuning in later, to throw down some comments on, other beer topics that you want to hear us talk about. Because we do this every week, and we have to do some research to find them. All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week.